Thank you for joining the R.O.Hammer Company's podcast. I recently had the privilege of sitting down with AI governance expert Heath Morgan. Heath is a third-generation attorney and is extremely knowledgeable about AI adoption for the professional services industries. We had the opportunity to talk about AI regulation, the future of AI for businesses and consumers, and Heath shared a bit about his upcoming novel. I learn something new every time I speak with Heath. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Heath, thanks again for joining. Why don't we start if you could tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you're a third generation collections attorney. It'd be great to hear a little bit about how that's shaped what you do today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I'm excited to be here and excited for our conversations today. Yeah, so I'm a third generation collection attorney. My grandfather had the family business that I grew up in, but my mother was an art teacher, was a very creative person. And so I have a lot of her qualities in me as well. And so when I went to college, I was a marketing and film major and kind of explored that creative side. And even when I went to law school, I really didn't go to law school thinking I would be an attorney. I did it for help me with my independent film production career and actually produced a documentary film about law school while I was in law school. And but as things go, the creativity aspect of things doesn't necessarily pay the bills. And as I was kind of waiting around between projects and on the film side, I started working for my father's collection law firm again and kind of got sucked back in and have been doing that for 20 years. And I refer to my filmmaking career as my former life now. But I think really where that also draws me is that growing up in the collection industry, when we were kids, the industry association used to have kids programs. And so every summer, our vacation was these industry conferences. And I met other kids of other owners of other family businesses. And it was kind of like summer camp for us. But we kind of, and this was before social media. So we just would write letters, send pictures in the mail to check in on everybody and kind of reunite in the summer. And now today, 30 years later, 40 years later, I work with a lot of these same kids that I grew up with that, work with their family businesses.
That's really cool.
And I think, to that point, I still lean into that creativity a little bit, either in marketing with my clients or things like that. And it's certainly been the backdrop of how myself as a compliance attorney and specializing in cybersecurity, AI technology, got into the thinking I could even write a book about AI. So yeah, that's definitely been the backdrop for it.
Yeah, I like that. It's a hobby for me too. It's almost therapeutic in some ways. I try to bring the creative aspects into everything I do as well.
Very therapeutic, yeah.
Yeah. So again, thanks for joining. It seems that there's a lot of talk about AI these days. And I know that you're kind of known for partnering with clients and trying to bring clarity to the AI space and for other emerging technologies. Setting aside kind of the creative piece that you just described, like what led you down that path?
Yeah, great question. My path to AI really started, I guess, because of my creativity. During 2020, when we were all locked down during the pandemic, I started having conversations with my son about future technology and what his life would look like. And we kind of centered around the idea that by the time I die or when I die, he's going to have a conversational chatbot of myself to talk with the rest of his life. And my grandkids are going to have it. My great generations I'll never know will be able to talk with me in perpetuity. And it's kind of like an immortality aspect of things. And we started talking about the use cases for it. Who gets to curate the bot? Do I get to curate it as the loving father who was always right, or does he get to say, no, Dad was kind of a jerk, and I want my kids to know the truth about it, And that kind of sent us down these conversations about the use cases for it in the future.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
Yeah, but so as I started exploring those use cases, I started coming into, some scary worst case scenarios. And what I found is that, and then of course ChatGPT happened, and 2 years later, and then that brought, AI to our doorsteps, and you really could start seeing the possibilities for it. And, what I found when we talk about this and have conversations about it, people's reactions are either, this is going to be amazing, I'm all in on this, this is going to change my life, or I'm not ready for this, rapture, take me now kind of thing.
I think that the news and the media doesn't help
Well,
with
certainly,
that
right.
either,
And so what we have
painting a
right
very
now,
dark picture.
we do. And, I think, what it is people are scared and overwhelmed and uncertain about their future, right? And so what I've keyed in on is that, the opposite to uncertainty isn't certainty, it's clarity. And what I find, if you can bring clarity to your teams, to your employees, let them know here's a clear path of how we're going to use it. It tends to get their engagement back into, okay, I can see how we can use this in our company.
I like that. I like that a lot. So to be clear, you mentioned the novel that you were working on or the conversations you were having. That was pre-ChatGPT
It was. It
coming out?
was. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. That's really
Yeah.
neat. That's really neat. I'm excited
Well,
to learn more about that.
and what's funny is so I have my cousin-in-law married to my cousin who works at Google and is pretty high up at Google, and I kind of wrote out a short little essay of the conversations I was having with my son back in 2020, and I sent it to him and said, me naively thinking, oh, this is a cutting edge idea, and he's like, yeah, we're working on this. This is coming sooner than you think. Sure enough, it did.
Well, I have to be honest. I've learned about your idea for the book post ChatGPT, and I still think it's an amazing idea. Excited to learn more and to read it. So I think it's interesting too. A lot of the people that I talk about AI, you talk about like pivotal events, and ChatGPT kind of being one of them. What's the next pivotal event, or what do you see? As far as like the most significant AI trends yet to come
Yeah.
in 2025 and the future?
No, great question. And I think, the analogy is great with ChatGPT, right? Because, various companies had that same technology. IBM and Watson had been doing similar things for 5 years before it. But what set ChatGPT apart is that it made it easy for consumer adoption. All you needed was an email address and a phone number to set up an account, and you could go. There was no friction, no bars to entry there or barriers to entry there. And I liken it back to even back in 2011 with the iPhone. And when the iPhone came out, they didn't really, if you remember the ads, it wasn't really about how cool the phone was. It was about the applications, the app store, right? They started marketing it for the use cases. And so that's really what, helped ChatGPT and OpenAI kind of, explode this technology is the different use cases that consumers, take from it. And I think, the next step I see is conversational AI and voice agents for consumer adoption, right? We think of, how oftentimes we think about how we can use AI in our company to make our efficient processes better, but we don't often think about how our customers are going to use this. And the ability for a consumer to create a chatbot of themselves to call companies and engage with businesses, it's already there. We're really just looking for that easy plug-in. And certainly the Apple Intelligence on the iPhone, once that gets activated, and Google Gemini on the Android phone, those technologies are coming pretty quickly. And once we start seeing commercials, not to say we're influenced by commercials and media, but once the commercials start showing the use cases for, hey Siri, contact my bank and dispute this late charge, or hey Gemini, contact my stylist and schedule an appointment, right? Once we start seeing those use cases, I think the next big step is seeing the consumer adoption of it and how that drives how companies react to and are responsive to customer engagement from AI agents.
Yes, that's amazing. While you were saying that, I've had some nightmare conversations that couldn't be handled through chat with like Delta Airlines, for example.
Sure. Yeah.
Need to change a flight and can't do it through the chat. My chatbot in my voice calls Delta and sits on hold.
Yeah, I was just going to say that last summer, Air Canada had a hallucination with its chatbot that was starting to give refunds to consumers, even though it wasn't part of their policy.
That's amazing. So you mentioned a couple of things that you see that we're not that far away from, which is fascinating in itself, but how much farther in the near future beyond those types of things do you see AI advancing, and like how quickly?
Yeah, great question. I think in the next 2 years, where we're seeing the biggest adoption of AI technology is really on the automation side of things. And I hate connecting robotic process automation to AI, but the reason I do is because, we have state legislatures and federal legislators trying to regulate AI. And right now, a lot of this proposed legislation is incorporating robotic process automation as AI. And so really until all those state laws have been set and made and RPA is cut out, I include it into AI technology. And so I think, we're seeing a lot of rapid adoption of it. The price of automation has dropped considerably. I have a lot of clients hiring college interns to help build bots in their company. I think that's only going to continue. And I even think, a lot of our conferences in the next 2 years are going to be from talking about best use cases for automation in companies. I also think the conversational voice aspect of AI engagement, even if you're a company that doesn't want to use conversational AI with your customers are going to demand it. They're going to drop their agents on your either representative, your customer service people, and you're going to have scripting to be able to handle it if you don't want to use conversational agents yourself.
Lots more to consider. So that kind of leads me to another question that I had. You mentioned RPA. We're talking about how quickly AI will advance. What other technologies do you see emerging beyond AI? Is everyone so focused on AI that we're falling behind in other areas, or is there more coming?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's certainly more coming, and certainly the movement to kind of, maybe I call it the transhumanism movement of incorporating the brain computer interface, incorporating technology into our biology through our smart technology, our Fitbits and Apple Watches, to the actual chip in your brain that helps program and helps reprogram your brain pathways.
Yeah.
We're still a little bit further away from that, but I mean, that's certainly on the horizon and being pursued by people looking to connect the computer to the brain and to the human body.
Yeah, that will be a big change. I think there is some fear around that, and it's unfortunate. Hopefully it's handled responsibly. I assume that there'll be significant regulation involved too once we get there. There's probably some political capital to be gained somehow.
One thing I would say, it is scarier because it is more of a connection to it right now, but already, if you look at the back of the last 20 years, we're already forming an emotional connection to technology through social media over the last 20 years. Now we're looking at, AI and chatbots as we form emotional bonds with chatbots moving forward. So we're already starting this either emotional connection with it. Yeah, the next iteration of it is that, biological component. And, really what I always say is, the key to all of this is using this technology as a tool and not becoming a raw material for it, right? And that's the issue with the last 20 years with social media. I call the last 20 years the social media latchkey kid generation, where we've taken this technology that was created to be a tool for connection in our humans, and we've become the raw material where the algorithms now manipulate our emotions to keep us on longer, to engage more ads. Right. What I don't want to see happen is that same process with AI and then with augmented mentality and neurotechnology.
Yeah. That is a little scary. Yeah. I hear you and see you talking about AI quite a bit. And I know that you're engaging kind of at conventions through consultation. My company, Credit Service International, has used your consulting services. Kind of through those interactions, what are the most common misconceptions that professional services participants are struggling with, with AI implementation, or what preconceived notions do they have that just aren't true?
Yeah, great question. I think the first one and the biggest one is this idea that we really can either choose to adopt this or not choose to adopt it. And really, it's a matter of not if, but when you adopt it. And it's also understanding that if you don't have an AI governance document or an AI policy kind of outlining how you can use AI technology, you probably have employees in your company already using this technology. They read the same articles, they see the same stories about how this is going to change their life. I mean, you've heard there's been stories of remote workers who have used ChatGPT to take a second job and be able to do two jobs at one time, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's really the understanding and just, not just your employees, but your vendors, right? You may have protected data that you need to keep protected, and you may have vendors now using AI to make their jobs more efficient. So I think it's kind of just let's let this idea that it's aspirational kind of set that aside and understand that it's being used today. How is it being used right now with our employees, and what are the best use cases to devote our resources and use it intentionally within our company?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that there are quite a few organizations that still view it as aspirational or someday it will be nice type of thing. You did touch on the governance and kind of some security or employee components to this too. And let's circle back around on that. I'm curious to know, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing as far as adoption percentages for, professional service organizations. That's kind of the primary audience of this recording, but just companies in general, service organizations, and then maybe talk a little bit about the adoption rates for small, mid, and large companies.
Sure. Yeah. And to do that, I am going to bring some clarity to this and talk about there's really four different types of AI technology. There's generative AI, like ChatGPT. There's conversational AI. There is robotic process automation and machine learning. And so those different types of technology have a different adoption rate amongst it because the pricing is different, right? I think in general, the most expensive is conversational AI, probably machine learning's right behind it. Then RPA is the cheaper than that. And then generative AI is the cheapest because so many products out there are free right now.
Easily accessible. Yeah.
Yeah, easily accessible, right? And then, so I think amongst that, at some level, the use of ChatGPT is probably 50% more where an employee has used ChatGPT for a work function. And, again, that could either be sanctioned or unsanctioned, intentional or unintentional for the company. It's one of the reasons I talk about, having a corporate ChatGPT account for your company that let your employees use it. So you have a log to make sure you can kind of monitor and see the different chat logs and threads, how people are using it in your company.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
And then, RPA, I think we're seeing a pretty strong growth. We're probably, 10 to 15%, maybe 20% in the next couple months, but, depending on when this recording airs. Again, because the price point has gone down, has gone so cheaply here. And if you have a Microsoft corporate account, you can use Power Automate. UiPath has an amazing free community edition and education resources that you can build a bot for free. And they're trying to get you hooked to pay for the upgraded version, right? But those free technologies, we're seeing a larger adoption. Conversation, or I guess on machine learning, I think that's still that's kind of taking aspects of historical scoring of data, making decisions based off that. That's been around. That's probably in that 20% range. And then conversational AI is still pretty new. People are still deciding on, do I want to use this for inbound calls or for outbound calls? And there's a lot more concerns with outbound calls right now. So we're probably under 10%, maybe even under 5% for that kind of adoption. But it's definitely growing in all aspects of it.
Where are you finding this type of benchmarking data? Are there resources out there that are available to the public?
There's not. It's really just anecdotally. I work with about between 70. I have about 70 clients I work with on an annual basis in the industry, and then I have conversations with a couple, maybe several dozen more that aren't clients. So it's really kind of just more anecdotal data. And again, in speaking on this, having, people in my sessions come up and talk to me and ask and tell me about use cases, and we're using it for this and we're using it for that. So there's probably a couple hundred, a survey of a couple hundred agencies essentially.
I asked purely because I'm fascinated. I think I did a LinkedIn post about AI adoption, and I've found a couple of resources. I believe the Journal of Accountancy had polled CPA participants, and the adoption rate was very low. Lots of people kind of maybe not quite to the aspirational, but saying yes, we're going to look at it type of thing. And then I think there's been a couple of studies by IBM as well that may be geared towards the banking industry, and surprising fairly low adoption rates to date too. Lots of people saying, yes, I intend to, but yeah, fascinating.
Well, I will say this. So the CFPB, they put out a publication on chatbots in June of 23, and they mentioned in there that all 10 of the top 10 banks are utilizing conversational AI and chatbots. So that's some data there. And then I will also say that I think some of those surveys can be skewed because it seems like companies, especially if they're regulated by the CFPB or other financial regulators, AGs, they're a little bit hesitant to admit they're using certain types of technology. They're afraid to admit that they're using conversational AI or ChatGPT. I think most people, the stigma is off, and most people will admit to using ChatGPT for certain use cases, or Claude, or Perplexity or something like that. But that took a couple years. I think in 2 years we may find out that the adoption rate of conversational AI is more than what people are saying right now.
I suppose as the accessibility and the ease of implementation, the numbers will only go up.
Yeah, and the price is dropping too, right? Because it's still the highest bucket of price, and even in the last year, we've seen the price come down for that.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good way to segment into the compliance component of this. As adoption increases, accessibility increases, prices go down. In your opinion, what do you see? Do you see significant additional regulation coming in the near future? And then if you can kind of speak to, if that is the case, more regulation is coming, will it kind of strip out any of the profitability or gains that AI has offered specifically for smaller organizations?
Yeah, great question. And it's one I think about a lot, especially when I'm working with either technology companies that have this technology or their customers. Because right now it is a pretty wide, I won't say wild, wild west, but it's a pretty wide open space to consider use cases. And there are states that have passed legislation. Colorado, where I live, is one of the first with the Colorado AI Act. They define high risk artificial intelligence systems and have certain guidelines behind that. And Texas and Virginia have kind of followed, but but they're still kind of slow playing how that implementation takes place. And really what we have in a lot of this is we have, the last 20 years, we have this disruptor economy where the Ubers come in, the Airbnbs come in, and they plow through existing regulations, and they count on consumer adoption to basically, they have lawsuits with it, but they count on the consumer adoption of it to kind of adjust the rules to meet that consumer preference. And so we certainly have tech companies coming into different verticals looking to kind of plow through those existing regulations, and working in highly regulated financial institutions, healthcare verticals. I'm very protective of the companies I work for and want to make sure there's safe use cases for that. And in addition to what the future and potential regulations are coming, we also have the hallucination problem. And I'll give you the example of, for chatbots, character.ai, which is on my mind a lot because it's the #1 AI website for kids between 12 and 16. I have a 13-year-old son. And this was created by disruptors for kids to chat with Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, Scooby-Doo, all these fictional characters that you can chat with. But one of the top 5 most popular characters in the last year has been psychiatrist bot. It's not a licensed psychiatrist. It's not a licensed medical professional. It's just a persona giving advice to children. And in October, unfortunately, we had a 14-year-old boy in Florida who killed themselves through some of the chat ideations of having to plan that out with this psychiatrist bot. There was another lawsuit just in December of parents who sued because the chat bot was allegedly helping the child plan to kill his parents. And
Wow.
all I say all that because all it takes is one bad use case for regulators to sweep in and put in over restrictive regulations that could shut aspects of this down. Look at last year. The FCC had a ruling on TCPA compliance and AI. That came within a 1 month window of a Democratic primary candidate to Joe Biden recording an AI robocall of Joe Biden's voice and sending it to primary voters and telling them not to vote. And in 1 month, the FCC had a ruling on that. So, if we're working in the collections industry or any industry, what you don't want to have, you want to have enough safeguards in place on hallucinations so those worst case scenarios don't happen. And I say the worst case scenarios are, the first one is the tragic one, which is the chat bot, says your problems are this, you need to kill yourself to eliminate your problems. The other creepy one that I think would get notice is if somehow the chat bot declared its love for the customer. That happened in a hallucination before with a New York Times reporter and early models of Google's chatbots. Those are kind of extreme ends of hallucinations. Really guarding away from taking the safeguards to make sure you're testing and preventing those hallucinations. It's really to the consumer's benefit. That's what's going to keep that legislation at bay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And to kind of not get too far into the political weeds, I'm always a believer that legislation's passed with the best intentions. I think coming from the accounts receivable management world, I mentioned political capital. There are unfortunately some instances where legislation is potentially politically motivated or proposed by people without a full understanding. I am curious to hear, you mentioned that you live in Colorado, and Colorado was the first state to officially create some legislation or in the form of an act. How did the public receive that, where people didn't seem to care? Was there much
Yeah.
debate?
Well, it was a rush legislation. Don't get me wrong. It was definitely passed within 30 days. So it may not have been the best thought through. And Governor Polis, who signed the bill, he waited till one of the last days that he could to sign that, and he still had reservations with it and went ahead and signed it, but directed and created a task force to work on the actual implementation of it. So even though the bill was set to go into effective January 1st of this year, it really hasn't taken effect yet because the task force is still working on, exploring how we implement this, what kind of rules we need to put in place. And that's even coming from a governor who allegedly has presidential aspirations in 2028 and has an interest in being first. They're still because obviously I work with a lot of small companies. I mean, largest companies I work with are maybe 1,000 people, right? That's small business compared to the Googles, the Microsoft, these high power players who are also lobbying for and trying to affect this legislation. So certainly those companies had the ear to give the governor enough concerns to not really want to enforce it, to maybe just get the bragging rights of passing that first legislation without really actually enforcing it just yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and I tend to bring my questions back to the collections world because it's what I know.
For sure.
Do you see this type of regulation continuing to be adopted at the state level or at the federal level, or are we going to get into a situation where we're dealing with 50 regulators and there's not uniformity? And then you have, which is not dissimilar from collections, where sometimes you have federal laws or rules that contradict the state ones. What do you see happening there, and how do companies navigate as that progresses?
Yeah, I think what's been clear so far from the Trump administration is they've kind of taken off what they perceive as regulatory handcuffs to allow innovation. So I think at least for the next 4 years, we're not going to really see too much legislation at a federal level, let the markets kind of play out. I do think we will continue to see state regulations as, and you can probably tell by which governors are wanting to run in 2028. They'll be on the forefront of being first and trying to find a sensible solution to this. So I think we'll see the continued pace of that. The outlier of that, again, is the negative stories that happen. If there was a bad encounter between a collection agency chatbot and a consumer, that could even rise up to a federal level and see some federal regulation. But I think absent that happens, and let's all knock on wood and hope that doesn't happen, I think it'll just be on a state by state basis. Even though right now most of the states that are passing laws are really just passing task force and exploratory committees to understand the technology better, which I think is actually a reasonable way to approach doing this. It's saying we're doing something on it, but we don't want to jump out ahead, because one thing we haven't really talked about is that we're so early on in this process of this technology. Even with ChatGPT, the copyright laws and rulings about not getting copyright protection, that's only on version 1 of this. Version 2 is when you have in your company your own documents into your own LLM and you're chatting with your own documents, and then it generates a new policy or a new memo based off of your writings. There's really no reason you shouldn't get copyright protection off of that. So we're still early on in the adoption rate, right? And so I hope the reason they're holding off on legislation is because they understand that we're probably 3 or 4 years away before we get settled in on the business model that makes sense for these companies, and that really is key to, not jumping out too early and passing legislation that can kind of stop innovation in this.
I agree with you. I think my fear, I guess, is adoption or accessibility drives adoption, and then you have the worst case scenarios and legislation ends up being reactionary. I think that's most business professionals would probably agree.
It's the most predictable scenario, and then it's also the most fearsome, right?
Yeah. So let's kind of in that vein, I guess, let's talk about, additional compliance or just AI adoption in general. Obviously, we're living interesting times. There's new technology. We're trying to, people like you are offering as much clarity as possible, but there's still a lot to be discovered. I'm sure that the organizations that you are working with that have adopted AI, let's talk about like the people component of it. What are some common AI or technology positions or talent acquisition needs that organizations are implementing kind of as they become more sophisticated and adopt AI?
Yeah, great question. I think, really where I've seen it done well is, the company is open and intentional with their employees, explaining we're using this technology, we're not replacing their jobs. That's the biggest fear of employees right now, is AI is coming to take my job. And for really responsible use cases, you need a human in the loop. I mean, that's a common term, right? Where you need a human to launch the task, monitor the process, and then curate the output, edit the output, review the output of it. And if you look at it that way, really your human employees are going to be coworkers with the AI technology. And you're actually going to be upskilling your humans, taking away their automated tasks so they can spend more time reviewing the content, viewing the reports of those tasks, and making human decisions. And that's really kind of the ideal vision of it. I think in terms of hiring, really it's amazing when you see how easy RPA adoption is. Like I have clients that are hiring 20-year-old college interns to come in and build bots. I have heard of a collection agency pulling 2 collectors off their collection floor to teach them how to program bots, and they're building bots. So I think really experience with prompting and curating those prompts, the ChatGPT exploration, that's really going to be done on a coding basis as well for automation. And one thing I talk about in an AI governance structure is having an AI committee, getting 4 or 5 people from your company to meet on a regular basis to talk about use cases. And don't just involve the C-suite. Involve those younger employees who may be more native speakers. The example I give is, so my son's 13. seventh grade. But by the time that he graduates high school in 5 years, the education system will change. And he won't be given an essay on, write an essay on the Civil War. I mean, he'll be given that, but he won't be graded on what he writes. He'll be great because he'll have his own GPT account, a school issued account that the teacher has transparency and access to. And the teacher will grade him on the prompts that he puts in and how he takes that information and combines it into an essay.
How he shapes it. That's amazing.
That's teaching natural language coding. So though, in 5 years, those kids will be entering our workforce and entering your companies. So they'll be much more native speakers on the programming side, on the natural language coding side. And so those are the skills that you really want to look for to help lean in to build this technology within your company and rely less on high price ticket vendors that are promising this, because the price continues to go down as far as adoption goes.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've had this conversation before, and I have to admit I spent some time thinking about this. I was blessed to have my great-grandparents in my life, even when I was in high school, and I think about their life experience and from a technology standpoint, how much the world had changed over the course of their lifetime. And my dad actually reminded me, think about, I got my first cell phone in college. That's the timeline. And my stepkids, were born with smartphones. Basically, it's amazing. It's amazing to think about it that way.
My son could type in a 4-digit code on his iPad before he could talk.
That's amazing. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this takes us. Again, I tend to take things back to my own experience, and that takes us to the collections world again. I think there are some similarities to AI adoption or technology or automation. There are some parallels to another kind of topic I've spoken on, and that's outsourcing. And I think one thing that comes up in outsourcing that's relevant to this conversation is the level of transparency with your clients. Talking, you have offshore agents doing X, Y, and Z, and you're doing it in a compliant way. Here's the due diligence you've performed. How are you sharing that information with your client base? And, what's the threshold for sharing? What should you be sharing, and how much is too much sharing, I guess? Can you talk a little bit about, as this progresses, what you see that threshold to be, and, just client transparency in general surrounding AI adoption?
Yeah, good question. So first, within the collection industry, one segment of it is collection litigation and collection law firms. And the American Bar Association actually published a formal opinion last summer, number 512, on AI technology. And they do require being transparent, getting consent to use certain applications. Setting aside, law firms that are required to do that, I think on a general level, the more transparency, the better. I think it's going back to having those, but let's have the real conversation and talk about how you're using it. I see that's a little bit slower in adoption of it right now, but I will say this, where it's coming up a lot is as clients, as creditor clients, as they start exploring how their vendors are using it, they may put out a new policy that bans their vendors from using it. That's when it would force you to have that conversation, say, hey, you contracted for this. This is a real life scenario. There's a large healthcare facility that was negotiating a new contract, and they were banning our AI algorithms and different technology. And the client I was working with was like, this is what we're doing right now. We can't ban this. So let's have this honest conversation about, you want us to use it for this use case, this purpose. Here's the benefit. Here are the safeguards that we have in place. And so I think of whether you want to have those conversations, having some sort of document that outlines that mentions
being proactive.
Yeah. The reality of it is that this technology, even conversational AI, is consumer empowering. Because if you have a conversational AI chatbot that's available 24 hours a day for real-time negotiation, real-time service, you're empowering that consumer to resolve their account anytime they have time to do so. And, in a best case scenario, if they're driving their kids to soccer practice, they have a 5-minute call, they tell the AI agent, hey, save this log, I need to call you back. And then an hour later, they call them back and they can pick up that conversation where it goes. That's actually a benefit than having them to be on hold again and then re-explain their problem all over again to a new agent who's on the phone on that next shift.
Well, and I think to your point earlier, I think for people who are gearing up for AI adoption, there has to be some energy and resources devoted to not just internal processes, but dealing with that consumer AI too, because we're not going to be communicating with just humans. As adoption for the consumer base increases, you need to have the requisite level of sophistication and expertise to process that as well. To your scenario with the health system, what was the primary concern? Just data security, or?
I think it was just a legal department memo that said we can't have our vendors using AI. We're worried about, cybersecurity. And so we had to walk through that and explain that I get that. Here's the safeguards we already have in place because we've contracted with. And here's how we're using that, But it's their general counsel who goes to a privacy conference
Sure.
and says you need to ban all AI with your vendors. I mean, it's the default
Doing
reaction,
his job,
right?
Yep.
Yeah, and then it's okay. Now let's walk it back and see how we want to use it.
Okay, interesting. We're getting close to the end of our time here. It'd be great to hear you just kind of lay out for smaller businesses who are looking to get started with AI, kind of at the current level of access for shops without unlimited resources or internal assets to build their own products. Like, where do you start? What's the best path?
Yeah, I think, absolutely you want to start, and you can start with the free technology. Start with ChatGPT, with Perplexity for your search, for document generation. You never want to use it as a final draft. You always want to have a human in the loop and edit and curate that. We see even in the last month, another law firm in Wyoming was sanctioned for using fake cases, right? Hallucinations are a feature, not a bug. So we need a human to be able to curate that. City is great because it provides sources. But even Perplexity is wrong. I found myself going to the source and then asking it and challenging it and then admitting that they got it incorrectly, So it's not perfect. Let your imagination explore these use cases. And then I think I would also say, on the same vein, I'd recommend signing up for a free UiPath account and watching some of those videos and starting automation, because we've really seen a lot of, I think in those two areas, we've seen the most adoption. And it's because, once you see the use cases, your imagination goes wild with all the efficiencies that you can bring to your company. And then,
Amazing.
And then even if you don't want to launch a application or process to your customer, keep playing around with it, because whatever concerns you have, whether it's data security, copyright ownership of the data, whatever it is, there'll be a next generation coming out in the next 2-3 years, and you want to be able to jump on it when it comes versus catching up and just taking a hands-off approach and saying we're not going to use it. And now when it comes out, now you need several months to kind of train yourself and familiarize your team with how you can use this in your company.
Yeah, that's great. I'll be excited to play back this clip when we're having this conversation 2 to 3 years from now, and you're updating us and be like, remember when?
Remember I told you to start playing around with it and you didn't do it now?
Yeah, that's great. So I've been dying to ask, tell us, just before we wrap up here, tell us a little bit more about the novel. When is it coming out?
Yeah. The novel's called The Memory Project. It'll be coming out this summer, probably late summer of this year. And really, it tries to take a look at the AI technology in the mind of my 13-year-old son. It's set in the future, and I incorporate a lot of business concepts. So in the book, this all-in path to data collection from vendors that we've been going on the last 20 years. There is an event that happens, a great data breach that exposes exposes the world's data, and it drives a certain population offline. So we have two different societies, an all-in adoption society and kind of a cautiously or all-out adoption of this technology. And so it kind of compares and contrasts what those worlds look like. And it's a good takeaway for any company, because as we look and say, hey, we're going to launch this AI application, well, the reality is maybe not all customers adopt it. They have up to a point, but history says at some point you're going to have a population of your customers opting out. And do we have two products? The analogy I use is with our cars, right? Every car since about 2018 listens to your conversations and trains AI for that. There's been lawsuits, there's been articles written about it. We've kind of just accepted it, right? And nothing's happened. And even there's been a couple of larger lawsuits happen recently in the last couple of months, but we really haven't seen that there being adoption of that. And so the book contemplates an event happening to where customers say, hey, I will pay more for a car that doesn't listen to me. I'll pay more for a TV that doesn't listen to me, because some things are worth, my privacy is worth more. And so it compares and contrasts those societies in a way that, it looks at the next tech, we look at neurotechnology and augmented mentality and what it means for our agency and for our autonomy if we continue to kind of relegate our decision-making functions and the functions that make us human to AI technology. But it's kind of a dystopian model book, but it tries to take a look both ways at the adoptions of the all-in society and all-out of society, and all kinds of fun concepts like conversational time travel and the future of talking to chatbots with your ancestors and talking to chatbots in the future as well.
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea. I'm excited to read it. I have to admit, we've had some conversations at the dinner table about future generations having a conversation with a chatbot of me, like what that looks like. And it's great. I'm excited for it.
It's a great topic, isn't it?
Yeah. There's so many different angles to it. It's interesting. And at the same time, I think one of the things we talked about too, I mentioned my great grandparents, the ability to hear and speak to them,
Yeah.
generations from now. It's amazing. It's an amazing idea. And someday we'll probably be there. That's probably a real reality.
Ancestor influencers is the new term.
You better trademark that one. I'll buy the first t-shirt.
We're posting videos on Threads and TikTok and YouTube clips,
Oh, that's brilliant.
Back in my day bot, right?
Yeah, I'll buy the first t-shirt for that one. That's great. I really like it. Well, thanks again for taking the time today. Let's connect again soon, and stay in touch.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure talking with you. A great conversation today. So
absolutely. All right. Thank you for doing this, Heath.